Hello and welcome to the Your Town television program. My name is Mark Baer and I'm going to get started right now with Jeffrey Becom. Jeffrey, and just for some of you who don't know, an architect, a photographer, and a painter as well. And so first of all, let's talk a little bit about your life and then we'll get into what we're doing here.
Well, my road was a really direct one. I was born outside of a little town in Indiana, and I knew there had to be more to the world than life there. I painted from a very early age, but my parents was afraid I'd end up starving as a painter, since there were no real examples of people who made a living in painting in Indiana. So I went through architectural school and got a degree in architecture, and ended up photographing painted architecture. And so that's what I've spent most of my time doing. But I really don't just do that. My real interest is in studying the reasons why people paint the way they do in traditional societies. So I've spent the last 35 years traveling the world and trying to interpret why people do things, studying the histories and myths and legends about the use of color in architecture and in cultures around the world.
Okay, well this brings us a little bit to the show we're going to do at the Museum of Monterey called Father Serra Before California. And you know, very few people even knew that before Junipero Serra ever stepped foot in what's today California, he founded a chain of mission churches that we're familiar with, but had founded a small group of mission churches in central Mexico. And so how did you learn about these missions?
Well, I'd already been traveling in Mexico and Central America working on a book on Maya villages for about 10 years, when I kept hearing some rumors that Father Serra, when I tell people I was from California, a few people off and on would say, I think there's some churches down in central Mexico that Father Serra built before he came to California. And I'd never I was interested, but I never found any, this was before the internet, and things were a little more difficult to find. And so I eventually saw, when I was in a city called Querétaro in central Mexico, a book on the architecture. I always go to the bookstores and look what's around, and I found a book that showed the 5 small churches that Father Serra had founded before moving on to California. But they looked absolutely nothing like California's churches. Much more elaborate, built of stone, highly Baroque, heavily carved, full 3-dimensional figures climbing out of the facades, fully painted in really rich colors. And I was really unprepared and frankly shocked when I finally got to these places, how beautiful they are and how different.
I think I'm going to stop you just so the audience can see some of this so we can carry
Certainly.
on. Let's have some pictures. Let's start with the first one if we can. And tell us what we're seeing here.
You're seeing one of the 5 little churches in these tiny villages of a few hundred people in these remote mountains in the Sierra Gorda Mountains in northern Querétaro state. And the interesting thing is, this was an area it's kind of the last of the conquest. The rest of Latin America had already been subdued and conquered and Christianized. And the people who simply didn't want that to happen to them, they all escaped to the most remote places. And this was one of the places they went to. Every time another group of priests or soldiers went to try and conquer them, they killed them all.
Let's look at some more here.
And they're just, so what happened in the 1750s, Father Serra was sent to try and pacify the people. And he took a different route than most of them. Most of them came in with clubs and crosses and basically beat the locals into submission. But he took a different process.
So look at this facade. I mean, this is just, we wouldn't see this in California,
You
would
would not. And the thing was that the people, and the reason, they're quite different from what we see in California for a couple of reasons. One was that the local population had come from areas where they're used to carving stone. And so that's one reason. And the other was Querétaro was a center for sculpture and stone carvers, and they sent a few of them up to train the local natives to do the stone carving. But the interesting thing for me, and what really drew me to these images, to these places, was the combination of native symbols and Catholic symbols, and they're just rampant on these.
Well, let's talk about it right here on the roof, for example.
Well, this is more Catholic than not. This is the Trinity, the early version of the Trinity, where they were three equal male figures, and then Saint Michael slaying the dragon, or Saint George, Saint Michael in this case, Saint Michael slaying the dragon. But many of the churches have this elaborate, and this is interesting. This is the interiors, which a couple of the churches have their entire interior still intact. So this is 1750. Of course, California's churches melted into adobe, most of them, but these churches, being built of stone, they survived the secularization of the mission churches, and so you still have some of the original feel, and feel what it would have been like in the 1700s. But wow. This is an example. This is some of the native influence that's carved into some of the churches. This is on Tilaco, Tancoyolo, you can see the feathers, you can see the tropical fruits. The tropics and native cultures had a lot to do with the belief in where life originated. And so they brought these, even though they're not really in the tropics here, they're bringing some of the tropical fruits to make that point. This is Tilaco, one of the churches. They're gorgeous, and this remote environment take the first trip that I went to took me 9 hours to get there from Querétaro City, which isn't easy to get to, and it was on unpaved roads and out in the middle of absolutely nowhere, and I just didn't know what I was going to find, and when I got there, it was just spectacular. And what's most interesting to me is all of this native fruits and vegetables and plants, things that have no meaning, and they kind of infill everything.
So let's talk about iconography, because this is what your passion is.
Yes.
Your passion is especially how they went with these missions and they incorporated the local, the animism in many cases.
Yes, absolutely.
And so let's talk about this.
This is, like, as I said, the last of the conquest. And these people had continued to live their pre-Columbian existence up until basically Father Serra subdued them with more with kindness than with military might. And so what happened was these facades the main figures are all Franciscan Catholic, as Father Serra and his cohorts were. But all around that are all of these native plants, many of them hallucinogenic, other ones medicinal, also a lot of ones that were used in religious ceremonies. So you have things like amaranth, which was a native grain that was used to make basically bread in the shape of the gods, and was used in a form of communion that they did before the Christians. They had there are lots of examples of things like cacao and feathers and tobacco all over these are all very, very important native plants. And then there are all of these flowers which were used as their symbols for basically their creation symbols. And they're all over the front. And we're still trying to decipher some of them to know really what they are.
How much of this culture is still alive down there?
It depends on where you are. That's what I go out and search for. I'm really very interested in finding the places that haven't been changed dramatically. And for instance, for about 20 years, my wife and I traveled to the Maya areas of Mexico and Central America, looking for the most traditional villages and trying to understand the culture. It's more anthropology than it was photography. But I love the backstory of the photographs that I put up. And so that's what I tend to do. And so I know we're doing another exhibit soon, which will deal with that.
Let's talk about that.
Well, the second exhibit upstairs is the Father Serra exhibit. Downstairs is going to be an exhibit of my more personal work, which is dealing with the use of color in traditional cultures. And so all throughout Latin America, which I've spent the last 25 years investigating, I looked for the most traditional places and then tried to understand why they were using color, why they weren't using color, and why those colors that they were using, what they meant. And often it had to do with really basic religious intention, and how in many of these cultures, if you painted something the right color, it came to life and it could help you. If you painted it the wrong color, it could turn evil and make you sick or even die in your dreams. So color has a very, very powerful influence on the native people. Now, and then trying to understand their cosmology and how that was related to the 4 directions and the colors associated with each of those directions, and how if you were a really powerful person, you could paint your house. And you would tend to paint it with one of the most powerful colors. But if you were just an average person, you didn't want to stand out in any way, because if you did, somebody might get jealous and send a witch in your dreams and kill you. So you tended to find villages that were all painted one color, except for one house, and that was the priest's house. And so it's those kind of things, or finding one, you would go to the cemetery and find them all incredibly painted, even if nothing else in the village was, because that was a safe place to invest your money, because if you had more money than someone else, again, somebody would get jealous and you would get in real trouble.
So kind of what you're telling me, so this sort of animistic, I don't like to use the word pagan, but indigenous.
Indigenous belief system.
And vision of color, and color as language.
Yes.
And color as meaning. And how has this informed you as an artist?
Well, originally when I started out back in the early 70s, I was really interested in just looking around and seeing what was out there. I had my degree in architecture was in modernism, and I was looking for the basis of that, where it came from. So I went to Europe to study, and I found that it was. I wasn't really drawn to the cities. I'm from a rural village, and so I found myself much more comfortable in these little rural villages, and that's when I started seeing more color, as opposed to the stone monuments that have really already been studied and documented. And so I just I learned the languages, I talked to the people, and eventually I started to understand how things worked and why they worked. And that led me down the road to where I am today. But it's all more or less direct. It's much closer to the basis here in Latin America than it was in Europe. Europe had been diluted to a large extent, but here there's still many villages that are still not speaking Spanish. There may be one person that speaks Spanish in the village and the rest speak the native language, and the one speaker of Spanish, that's all they need. He's the interpreter for the village. We have such a completely different mindset than they do down there, and that's what really interests me, trying to understand a different culture. And in my photographs, the hope is that I celebrate a culture that's incredibly complex, that we don't see as that way, and that I can celebrate their culture, and people will look at my photographs and say, that's a really interesting place, that's a really interesting subject, even though it's in my interpretation, and hopefully will be a door to open people's imaginations to look further into cultures they consider primitive.
Now, I know you've spent a great deal of time in Latin America, but I know a few years back you spent a lot of time in India. And what did you find in common? What was the commonalities that you find? Because again, you were searching color, you were searching design, you were searching language.
In India is synonymous with color to most people, and I found that the reason colors were used on certain buildings, the reasons they were used in certain costumes, the reasons they were used to color certain gods were traditional, and they're consistent. And if you deviate from that, you're in trouble. You're basically false, you're lying. And so that's a very similar thing to what was going on in Latin America. You didn't paint something the wrong color, or it either didn't work, or you were considered false. And in India, if you painted your house blue, you were pretending, if you weren't a Brahmin, you pretending you're a Brahmin, you could get in serious trouble, because that's the color of the Brahmins. And that kind of thing went throughout the culture. And it was a wonderful experience, just a tiny introduction. I was there for 4 months. I consider that a brief introduction to a small part of a country. Because when I go, I tend to go for 5-6 months and keep going back to the same place until I feel more comfortable in it.
Now, one of the things I want to make sure, because we don't have a lot of time, as much time as I'd like, give the audience a couple of your book titles so they can look at them up online, because I can't describe this adequately, so they need to investigate a little.
The first main book was, major book was called Mediterranean Color, and it was dealing with traditions of color in Southern Europe and North Africa. And then the main book we wrote more recently is called Maya Color, The Painted Villages of Mesoamerica. And then this booklet on the Father Serra missions is...
You want to hold that up?
Is, let's see, where are we going? Oh, let's try that. That'll work. It dealt with the Father Serra missions, and so that is a more recent one. But I'm working on one right now on South America, Andean villages, and that'll eventually come out. I spent the last 5 years dealing with that culture.
Okay, it's jeffreybecom.com?
Yes.
Okay, that's JEFFREYBECOM. I strongly recommend that you check out this work. I mean, it's amazing. Again, a small town where we are and have world-class artists living here. Jeffrey, it's a pleasure.
Well, thank you, Mark. Thank you for your enthusiasm, and I'll look forward to putting the shows up there at the Museum of Monterey and getting a different audience to have the opportunity to look at them.